the 2nd of February 1943, Stalingrad, the Soviet Union. The German 6th Army, after 5 months of fierce fighting and heavy casualties, having exhausted their ammunition and food, finally capitulates, making it the first of Hitler's field armies to surrender during World War II. The battle for the city proves a decisive psychological turning point, ending a string of German victories in the summer of 1942 and beginning the long retreat westward. The Red Army remains on the offensive, and in July 1944 captures Majdanek, the first major Nazi camp to be liberated in the territory of German-occupied Poland. Soviet officials invite journalists to inspect the camp and to see for themselves the evidence of the horrors that have occurred there. Less than 5 months later, on the 3rd of December 1944, Majdanek becomes one of the first former Nazi sites where justice is carried out. On that day, the camp's former personnel will pay for their crimes with their own lives when they are brutally executed in front of 15,000 people. This mass execution, which occurs in Lublin, is recorded by official press photographers and resembles a theater of horror. Majdanek, situated in the southeastern suburbs of Lublin in German-occupied Poland, was originally established in late 1941 as a camp for prisoners of war. However, it soon evolved into a full-scale concentration and extermination camp. Built under orders from Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and administered by Odilo Globocnik, the SS and police leader in the Lublin district, Majdanek was intended to serve both economic and genocidal purposes. The camp was designed to house up to 150,000 prisoners, making it, at least on paper, one of the largest camps in all of occupied Europe. However, logistical challenges and the changing tide of war prevented the Nazis from fully realizing this vast plan. Majdanek consisted of 3 main sectors: the SS administrative area, an economic zone with workshops and storage buildings, and the prisoners' camp. The latter contained 5 fields of wooden barracks, where inmates were forced to live in conditions so primitive and overcrowded that disease and death spread rapidly. Basic sanitation was virtually non-existent. Prisoners endured freezing temperatures in winter and sweltering heat in summer, often with broken windows and little protection from the elements. Over time, barracks intended for a few hundred people housed more than 1,000, creating a breeding ground for lice, typhus, and other deadly illnesses. The daily life of the prisoners was marked by extreme hardship, cruelty, and terror. From the moment of their arrival, detainees faced dehumanization. Larger transports arrived in overcrowded cattle cars, and smaller groups were trucked in from nearby areas. Once inside the camp, they were stripped of all their belongings, and their hair was shaved, some of which was later shipped to German companies to be used in industrial production. New arrivals were sent to the bathhouse for a painful and humiliating disinfection process before being registered with a number that replaced their identity. Jewish prisoners underwent selections upon arrival, and those deemed unfit for labor, including the elderly and children, were immediately sent to the gas chambers and never even recorded in the camp's files. Majdanek functioned both as a concentration camp and as an extermination site. Prisoners came from nearly 30 countries. The majority were Polish Jews and ethnic Poles, but there were also many from the Soviet Union, Slovakia, and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Others came from Western Europe, including France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, especially toward the end of the camp's existence, when the Nazis began relocating sick and emaciated prisoners from other camps. Among the prisoners were Soviet prisoners of war, resistance members, civilian hostages, displaced families, and entire Belarusian villages deported in reprisal for partisan activity. Some inmates were merely caught in street roundups or accused of aiding the resistance. Punishments for even minor infractions were brutal and often fatal, and public beatings and lashings at roll call were common. Prisoners could be forced to stand motionless for hours, endure back-breaking penalty exercises, or be hanged by their wrists with their arms twisted behind their backs. Escape attempts were met with execution, usually carried out in front of the entire camp as a warning. Inmates were routinely beaten, attacked by SS dogs, or even drowned in fire basins and sewage pits. The SS guards, along with selected prisoner functionaries, wielded almost unchecked power over the lives of those held at Majdanek. Children, whom the guards saw as useless eaters, were often whipped and, on a few occasions, the camp personnel would grab them by their hair and threw them on trucks heading to the gas chambers. They would pull the children's hair so hard that whole tufts would remain in their hands. Sometimes children were murdered in front of their parents, and the personnel would even whip pregnant women to death. Men, women, and children were also killed by the camp personnel, who stomped on them with their steel-studded jackboots. Mass murder at Majdanek was carried out through multiple methods, including firing squads, gas chambers, and deliberate neglect. From the autumn of 1942 to the summer of 1943, gas chambers using carbon monoxide and Zyklon B were used to kill thousands, primarily Jews. Selections continued even after prisoners were registered, with the sick and weakened often segregated into so-called gamel blocks, barracks where they were left without food or medical care until they died or were taken to be gassed. For many, the only way out of these barracks was through death. The crematoria played a key role in hiding the evidence of mass murder. Initially, victims' bodies were buried in mass graves, but as the scale of extermination increased, open-air pyres and specially constructed crematoria were used to dispose of the corpses. One of the most horrific single-day massacres at Majdanek occurred on the 3rd of November 1943, when around 18,000 Jews were murdered in an operation called Erntefest, or Harvest Festival. Victims were forced to undress and lie down in large trenches before being shot in the back of the head. Music was played over loudspeakers to drown out the sound of the gunfire and screaming. This massacre remains one of the largest single-day mass executions in the entire Holocaust. In May 1944, the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, established a labor camp in one of Majdanek's prisoner fields to conscript locals into building field fortifications around Lublin in preparation for a Soviet assault. By that time, the fate of the Third Reich was becoming increasingly clear, and Majdanek's existence was drawing to a close. As the Soviet forces advanced closer in 1944, the Nazis began hurried evacuations of Majdanek's prisoners. In March and April 1944, around 15,000 prisoners were transported by train to camps deeper within Nazi-occupied territory, including Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen. In early July 1944, the last 1,000 surviving prisoners, mostly men capable of working, were marched off on foot, only days before Majdanek's liberation. These forced marches were brutal. Prisoners already weakened by malnutrition, disease, and hard labor were driven on foot for long distances under harsh conditions, and many collapsed and died along the way. Those unable to continue were often shot on the spot by the guards. The SS made only limited efforts to destroy the evidence of their crimes at Majdanek before abandoning the camp. Some documents were burned, and certain facilities were set on fire, but much of the camp remained intact. Of the estimated 130,000 men, women, and children imprisoned at Majdanek during its operation, approximately 80,000 died. Around 60,000 of those victims were Jews, making Majdanek one of the principal killing centers of the Holocaust in occupied Poland. Others who perished included Polish political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and individuals from across Europe. After the liberation of Majdanek on the 23rd of July 1944, Soviet and Polish authorities moved quickly to secure the site and begin the process of documenting the atrocities that had occurred there. Unlike many other concentration camps, Majdanek was not completely destroyed by the retreating Germans, and much of the camp's infrastructure, including gas chambers and crematoria, remained intact. As the full extent of the crimes became visible, the first efforts to bring the perpetrators to justice began almost immediately. In the following months, 6 former members of the Majdanek personnel who had been captured were arraigned before the Soviet-Polish Special Criminal Court. These individuals included SS Obersturmführer Anton Ternes, SS Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Gerstenmaier, SS Oberscharführer Hermann Vögel, SS Rottenführer Theodor Schöllen, and 2 prisoner functionaries, Edmund Pohlmann and Heinrich Staub. The trial, which lasted from the 27th of November to the 2nd of December 1944, focused on the crimes committed at Majdanek and was deeply shaped by the atmosphere of public outrage and the desire for swift retribution. During the proceedings, Edmund Pohlmann committed suicide in his cell, leaving 5 defendants to face sentencing. During the trial, both survivor testimonies and defendant confessions brought the horrors of the camp to light. Heinrich Staub described how Jewish mothers had led their children into the gas chambers while telling them fairy tales to calm their fears. Hermann Vögel admitted that during Operation Harvest Festival in November 1943, thousands of inmates, mostly Jews, were murdered by firing squads while loud music played over the camp's speakers to drown out the sound of gunfire. Witness Bronisław Baran recalled how the air was filled with music as countless Jews were systematically gunned down. Testimonies like these, coupled with evidence gathered by the Soviet-Polish Commission, painted a grim and undeniable picture of mass extermination. Among the prosecution's key witnesses was Piotr Sobolewski, a member of the investigative commission, who testified that, based on the enormous quantity of clothing and belongings found at Majdanek, as many as 1.5 million people had been killed there. Sobolewski also noted the large stockpiles of Zyklon B discovered on site, claiming it was sufficient to kill millions. While these figures were later revised downward by historians, at the time, they fueled the court's portrayal of Majdanek as a death factory, a term that entered common usage in Polish discussions of Nazi crimes. In an atmosphere of continued wartime hardship and public anger, the proceedings inside the courtroom were broadcast to the crowds gathered outside via megaphones. The crowd included people who were screaming and crying for the loved ones they had lost at Majdanek, and on one occasion these people literally attempted to tear the defendants to pieces in the street as they were being escorted to the courtroom. Prosecutors, reflecting the political climate of the time, often used the trial not only to highlight the guilt of the defendants, but also to deliver sweeping condemnations of German history and culture, framing the crimes of Majdanek as the culmination of centuries of German aggression against Slavic peoples. Defense attorneys, recognizing the futility of their position, offered only brief and largely symbolic arguments. They could hardly do more, especially when some of the defendants, such as the former deputy camp commandant SS Obersturmführer Anton Ternes, made their position clear during the trial, saying, "The people here were mostly Jews. They were not real prisoners of war. I am not a sadist." His attorney named Krzymowski referred to Ternes, who at Majdanek was infamous for beating both men and women, as a true Satan of death. Some attorneys, however, pointed out that other defendants, such as Heinrich Staub, had themselves been prisoners, or tried to argue that their clients had been drawn into the machinery of destruction. However, these arguments had little effect. All 5 surviving defendants denied their guilt in their final statements, but the outcome was inevitable. They were found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death by hanging. On the morning of the 3rd of December 1944, gallows were erected at Majdanek itself, near the crematoria where so many victims had been burned. The news that the execution would be carried out publicly at the site of their crimes spread instantly throughout Lublin. Around 15,000 people gathered, including survivors, grieving families, and residents of the city. Among them was a young girl named Fega Steshe, just 14 years old, who had survived Majdanek. Still wearing her striped camp uniform, she made her way through the crowd. As she approached, she called out, "Let me through! I was at Majdanek! I'm wearing a striped uniform!" Moved by her words, the crowd parted, allowing her to stand at the very front. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of anger, grief, and a desire for justice. Some in the crowd cried openly, others stood in heavy silence. Tension hung in the cold air. The trucks that brought the condemned men were used as a trapdoor, and the method chosen for the execution was the short drop hanging technique, in which the condemned were not dropped from a sufficient height to cause immediate death by the breaking of the neck. Instead, they suffered a prolonged and torturous death by strangulation, which could last between 10 and 20 agonizing minutes. When the moment came, and the drivers of the trucks started the engines and moved slowly forward, the 5 former members of the Majdanek staff were executed. Some witnesses described an eruption of noise from the crowd, while others remembered an eerie, almost stunned silence settling as the bodies dangled lifelessly from the gallows. Although many had anticipated a sense of satisfaction or closure, for many onlookers, the executions brought only a deeper sense of sorrow and unresolved pain. Observers later recalled that even as the guilty swung from the ropes, the terrible scale of the crimes committed at Majdanek made the punishment feel somehow inadequate. After the executions ended, the aforementioned Feige Steche, who had watched it all unfold, turned and walked away silently. Due to incompetence by its deputy commander, Anton Thurnes, who was given the task of destroying the evidence of crimes against humanity and genocide, but ran out of time due to his ineptitude and lethargy, Majdanek is the best preserved camp of the Holocaust. With the war still ongoing, it was preserved as a museum by the autumn of 1944, and the first permanent exhibition was opened in the following year. Today, Majdanek stands not only as a preserved memorial to the victims, but as a lasting reminder of the horrors that unchecked hatred and cruelty can unleash. The pursuit of justice for Majdanek's crimes, however imperfect, continues to echo as a warning to future generations that such atrocities must never be allowed to happen again. Thanks for watching the World History Channel. Be sure to like and subscribe and click the bell notification icon so you don't miss our next episodes. We thank you, and we'll see you next time on the channel.